Hello, my friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast. I am so happy that you're joining me, and I'm also happy that I'm going to be joined by my guest, Dr. Benjamin Powers. Dr. Powers is an educator, researcher, and thought leader who believes that cerebrodiverse learners should be embraced for their strengths and potential. Now, throughout his career, he has championed evidence-based approaches that recognize individual strengths, promote independent thinking, develop self-esteem and advocacy, and fuel academic achievement. And Dr. Powers is here with us today to talk about literacy and how we can close the literacy gaps.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social-emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Dr. Powers, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be on the show.
I'm really excited as well, and I really appreciate all the work that you do. Like I said before we hit record, I've been looking at all the work that you're doing, and it aligns so much with the work that I do, the work that we do at Child Nexus. And so I'm just excited to have you here to talk about reading and the science of reading. And I'd love to kind of just jump in and start with the basics, because I think people have a lot of questions about what do we mean by the science of reading. So maybe you can start there with what science of reading really means and even how it differs from other literacy approaches.
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, hugely popular question right now.
Yes.
So many schools, are trying to make this shift into the science of reading. And so parents, educators, school leaders, all really try to, wrap their hands around this. And I think, when we think about the science of reading, I think one thing we have to be really mindful of is acknowledging that there is no one science of reading. The science of reading is really this notion of what we have built up over decades of research on understanding the most effective practices to learn to read. And so, as a country, we've been really so focused on things like whole language or balanced literacy. And while those approaches felt good, decades of cognitive science, neuroscience, and education research have shown us that we know there are really specific and important components of developing a reading brain that we need to have in our instructional models. And so as an example, we know that being really explicit in teaching the code, and by the code, I mean linking the graphemes, the letters with the phonemes, the sounds, and being very explicit in how we teach code to kids is critically important to building a reading brain. So the science of reading is really, best way to describe it is that collected research knowledge that informs how we should be instructing students in literacy in schools.
Right. And I think that some parents are probably asking themselves, does the school that my child attend, are they aware of the science of reading, and do they incorporate that research into their modes of instruction? And that's not always the case.
That's right. Exactly. And I think, to be fair, I think a huge challenge here has been that a lot of the science of reading has come from, the university level in the departments of psychology, right? And the departments of education and the departments of psychology don't always communicate. And so, to be fair, in a lot of ways, we've done a huge disservice to educators in this country because we haven't put this in front of them during pre-service training for teachers. And of course, our administrators are former teachers, and so they don't, they may not be as knowledgeable or as experienced as they would like to be. And so it's a great question, because I think as schools really try to tackle this question, it's putting a huge demand on educational leadership, on the teachers to really become informed consumers of materials, of curriculum, so that they can help, they can make this shift effectively.
Right. And we know that there has always been a delay in the research getting into the hands of people who can use the data to implement in everyday life and improve the lives of people. That's just how research is.
That's right. There's actually a great Emily Solari and some colleagues, Yakov Petcher. They developed this really beautiful visual of this, that time frame. Like, anytime we're doing research, you start at a very global level. You come up, just like we learned the scientific method in grade school. You have to form your hypothesis. You have to test your hypothesis. And then that has to go all the way through to really rigorous research, like a randomized control trial. And then by the time that's settled and we have findings from that, we also want to replicate those findings and then publish those findings, which usually takes years, and then disseminate that into the public domain. And so you're absolutely right. It takes a long time for the science to get into the hands of individuals. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the focus on the National Reading Panel report from 2000, the pillars of, the important pillars of reading instruction. That's from 2000. It's really only in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years that people have really started to reference that frequently at the public school level. So yes, there's a huge gap in time for that.
Absolutely. And what we've talked a lot about on this podcast is equity, the issue of equity. And I'd love to kind of talk about how the science of reading, because it seems intuitive to me, can really help close those achievement gaps, particularly for students from diverse backgrounds with language-based learning differences. Have you found that as well? I know that you've talked about this a great deal.
Yeah, what I think is, one of the interesting things is that part of the reason we know so much about the reading brain is because of people with learning disabilities like dyslexia. The National Institute of Health fueled a lot of research on non-readers or readers who have a learning disability like dyslexia, really in the 90s and into the 2000s. And that's part of why we know so much about how the reading brain develops. So the interesting thing is, it's because of people, who are not meeting kind of, typical benchmark that we understand so much. So that in and of itself is a lever to think about equity and inclusion in terms of how we think about accessing kids who, for a variety of reasons, may struggle with the printed word. And so the beautiful thing is that knowledge that we've gained about the reading brain, what it helps us understand is that every single learner benefits from using a basis of the science of reading and instruction, but especially students who have been disenfranchised for a variety of reasons.
And that is something that we can take and really run with, because it feels like if we see this gap in achievement where we see lower reading scores, significantly lower reading scores in under-resourced communities and under-resourced schools, that we can bring in our knowledge of the science of reading and incorporate it into those curriculums, not just for students who have language-based learning differences or dyslexia, but for all students.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's the huge opportunity. And it's interesting. It's part of the work we actually started even at my school about 10 years ago, where we started going into communities that were under-resourced, like Bridgeport, Connecticut. And, what we've learned from that experience is, number one, you have to be a really good listener. I don't know if you know who Dr. Julie Washington is, but
yes.
Yeah. So Julie's amazing. And she was really influential in this work because she helped us understand that, going into communities that are under-resourced, it's not just having the curriculum, it's not just having the science of reading that's helpful. It's also being good listeners, being good partners, and understanding the environment. But what I can tell you is, having invested a lot of time in that work, what we do see is by bringing in really good evidence-based reading practices, not only do the teachers feel so empowered and so it's an uplift for them because they feel like they're on a different level to be able to instruct and help their kids. But we've also seen substantive changes in the outcomes of reading scores for these kids. And so, is an identification or diagnosis important for a kid, who has dyslexia? Absolutely. But in a way, instructionally, it does not matter. When you come into a system, again, everybody benefits from, an approach that's based in the science of reading. So if we start there, if we start from a basis that we know the science of reading is effective, let's give it to everybody, especially in these disenfranchised communities. If we start at that level, then the tweaks or adjustments in terms of dosage or intervention we're going to have to make are going to be much different than if we started from a framework of not having that in place.
Absolutely. And that just speaks to the idea that, this really the importance of neuroscience in informing our literacy efforts, which is basically the science of reading, but then also how we can use that information to really address the inequity in education in many areas. I mean, you are a fervent believer, as am I, in the power of early intervention. And, parents sometimes delay. And that's probably one of my biggest concerns is that parents will hear from either other parents or educators that their kids will grow out of it. Or, my son was a little behind as well, and he caught up by fifth grade. And I'd love for you to speak about, the early implications of early intervention for reading challenges and why it's so important. And I know that brings us back to the science of reading, but it's just such an important piece that often gets overlooked.
It's so important. And I think, a really good analogy that I like to use for this is learning a foreign language. The older we are, the harder it is to learn a foreign language. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But one is this notion of what's called synaptic pruning. We are all born with the ability to learn, all these different, any language. And I was just talking with my kids the other night about this because they were talking about the difficulty of rolling their R's with language like Spanish when they're learning it as older kids. We all have that ability when we're born. And of course, our brain prunes away synapses that we just don't need or we're not using. And so the reason I reference that is when we think about early intervention, there is an exponential impact of doing intervention in kindergarten and first grade versus second grade, third grade. So the time we need, the frustration, even the economics of it, it all aligns with the fact that we know when we're developing a reading brain, earlier is better because there's just going to be more uptake. There's just, there's just a better foundation to be able to actually have the intervention be impactful in a more efficient way. Now, it's never too late to do an intervention. I want to be really clear because that's a question sometimes we get asked, and parents will ask me, "Hey, it's never too late. Intervention's always the right model for anybody who's struggling with reading." But we absolutely know, and Dr. Nadine Gabb, in Boston, who developed the what was called BELLS at the time, the Boston Early Literacy Screener, which is now Early Bird. She spent years and years on this research with really young children in fMRI and brain scans, she and her team. And again, there's so much evidence that, it's irrefutable. Early is exponentially better.
Absolutely. And we know, because we know this, and, in California now we have the early literacy screenings, which is fabulous. I think it should be mandated across the United States, that screenings for dyslexia, because again, early intervention can change the trajectory of a child's education, of a child's life. And as you were saying, we have those critical years, kindergarten, first grade, where kids are learning to read. And we've talked about this on the podcast, that after that, kids have to read to learn. And if they are still learning to read, it keeps them from accessing science, geography, social studies, English in a significant way.
That's absolutely right. And I think one thing we sometimes don't think about, and I have a slide that I usually use in presentations I give. One of the things we don't think about is that often the types of language, the types of words students are encountering in print very early in school are what we would call Old English words. So as an example, the word night, K-N-I-G-H-T. Now there's a reason it's spelled that way. We won't get into that right now. But a lot of the words that students are encountering early in school are the ones that are less structured or are more outliers, like the word the. And so when we think about the kind of text they're experiencing and being exposed to, like K3, it's not just that the science of reading is so critical to build the reading brain early on. It's also critical because what happens, as we know, fourth and certainly by fifth grade, as we shift into textbook language, the language shifts significantly. We get into a lot of Latin and Greek code in fourth, fifth grade, a lot of multisyllabic words. And what we see is even students who seemed to be good readers early on in school, we see is we see this dip. We all of a sudden see this drop in so many kids, fourth, fifth grade, because they don't have the tools or resources to be able to even decode those multisyllabic words. Never mind understand what they're reading, which is the whole point of reading. So right, so there's a lot of good reason why that early instruction is so important.
Absolutely. And I think Julie Washington has said that, when you are a struggling reader, a science test is not a science test, it's
a reading test. She's 100%
yes.
right. Absolutely.
Right. Yes.
But what's so interesting is, and I'll use morphology as a great example. We talk a lot about derivational and inflectional morphology. And inflectional morphology is as simple as understanding that when we add the letter S to a word, it usually means it's a plural. Whereas derivational morphology is helping strengthen students' understanding of word knowledge, like that D means down. So when we descend the stairs, right, we're going down the stairs. And so especially for students who may have been, who may have gaps in their vocabulary, who may not have been exposed to as much print for a variety of reasons, using the science of reading, that's a specific example of why the science of reading can be so effective. Teaching kids things like morphology really kind of ramps up their vocabulary, their ability to comprehend, their ability to decode, their ability to increase and improve their fluency. And so, those are things that really help level the playing field for all kids.
I wanted to take a moment to share with you some information about one of our incredible Child Nexus partners, Westmark School. What's the best way to empower kids with dyslexia and other language-based learning differences? By teaching the way their brains work. That's exactly how students are taught at Westmark School, offering research-based methodologies and differentiated instruction in a nurturing environment. Now accepting inquiries for grades 1 through 12. To learn more about how they stimulate bright minds and celebrate neurodivergent strengths, inquire today at westmarkschool.org. Now back to our conversation. And, as I'm listening to you talk about the science of reading and how it works and how it's effective, parents are listening to this and hearing this. Some might be hearing this for the first time. Are there things that they can do to collaborate with educators to ensure that their kids, all the kids, in their child's school, are getting the support they need with respect to reading?
That's a great question. I think one important factor in thinking about parents and schools is that it's really good to ask questions. Sometimes, in my experience, parents have shared that they were reluctant or they waited too long to ask questions simply because they see the school as the expert. And so they don't want to kind of push back against the school maybe or ask questions. What I always suggest to parents is, if you do it in a collaborative way, if you do it in a productive way, it can really lead to, a good conversation. I think understanding, asking questions and understanding how is instruction being done in the school? What types of curriculum and resources are you using? And sometimes it takes a little bit of research on the parents' part to really kind of start, digging into that, doing a little research. Is this aligned with the science? Which can be a little tricky, but asking those questions up front, is really helpful. And there are some great resources like the National Center for Improving Literacy, NCIL. NCIL has a lot of resources for educators, but also for parents to help support students. There's another great resource, which is the Florida Center of Reading Research, FCRR. Again, tons of great resources for teachers and tons of great resources for parents to understand the types of things they should be seeing coming home or the types of questions they could be asking, but also things they can actually do at home with their kids to help support them outside of the classroom.
Right. And that piece is really important as well, because even if schools have not adopted some of the, the evidence-based approaches to reading, there are things parents can do to support their kids, but they have to know what those things are.
That's right. Then we know there are some simple things we can do, even read alouds, reading aloud to your child. That's incredibly helpful because it gives them access to vocabulary. It gives them insight into things like how does a good reader read with intonation and prosody so it opens up a lot of doors for them. But reading aloud is in and of itself not enough. I mean, it's important to have books in the home. It's important to have shared reading experiences. But there are things we can do as parents, even early on, even with pre-readers, things around oral language. We know, and again, we know this from neuroscience, and a Haskins colleague, Jay Rickel, led a really important study on this with a team of colleagues from Haskins. That what we know is that the reading circuit overwrites a lot of the speech circuitry. So unless we have a really good speech engine and good oral language in our kids, we cannot expect to have a good reading brain develop, because the reading brain needs that developed and coded speech circuitry to be effective.
Absolutely. And it's just interesting to me how, even though we have these evidence-based reading instruction approaches that have been shown to be proven and effective, there, still is a struggle to implement them consistently. And you've talked about some of the reasons for that delay in getting the science into the hands of educators. Are there other barriers to adoption that schools can overcome? And maybe parents can be part of the solution to this and starting those discussions?
Well, yeah, unfortunately, I mean, there are certainly a number of barriers, and to put it out there, I think one big barrier has been textbook publishers. There's a moral hazard there. They drive a lot of what ends up in our schools. And unfortunately, I think we haven't done the best job supporting our academic leaders. And I think a lot about assistant superintendents who are often focused on the curricular pieces. A lot of times they're in a difficult position where they're choosing between, these different commercial products, and they don't necessarily have the framework or the resources to be able to evaluate those tools effectively. So I think, it's great that we pass legislation. It's great that we make mandates. But until we actually are in a position that we can provide those resources to really be able to help vet these types of things, that's a big roadblock. I think another big roadblock is time. We don't have the time we need, unfortunately, to be able to train teachers as effectively as we should be, because they're not getting it in schools of ed. They're literally building the plane as they're flying it. So I do think, another big barrier is thinking about how do we help influence, or how do we help push into schools of ed. But I think at the ground level for parents, a big opportunity really is making that inroad, asking questions at parent-teacher conferences, getting information, from the school district about what types of materials or resources they're using. And if it doesn't seem to be aligned, making that appointment with the right school leader, to bring to their attention and say, hey, I'm hearing this, or this is what, this is what's validated by science. How are you aligning with this? What tools are you using? Or why? We're asking that tough question. Why aren't you aligning with that? And I think this is why parent groups like Decoding Dyslexia have been so influential in really shifting this conversation, because, everybody's voice matters. And unless we each use our voice, change is not going to happen. But that building that community and that collective voice is what really brings power to that conversation.
Right. And I feel like, as I'm hearing you talk, there are multiple barriers, but it also means that there are multiple opportunities to intervene and solve the problem, right? At the education level, at the school level, at the parental advocacy level, and which is a great thing.
That's that's 100% right. It's very well said. Each of these barriers is also an opportunity for sure. And the beautiful thing is there are resources, there are curriculum, there are tools out there that schools and teachers can implement tomorrow, today, even, that really can start that shift. And I think, what I've seen, I've had the opportunity to do a lot of work in different school systems. And what I've seen is, taking that first healthy, getting the teachers, getting the school leaders to take that first healthy risk, that leap of faith to try something new that aligns with the science of reading, and seeing it work has, builds up that runway to really shifting, how instruction is being done in schools. And, it takes time. I think we all have to be reasonable about that expectation, but once that shift starts to happen, it's really incredible to see it take off.
Right. Absolutely. And that brings me to the Southport School. I'd love to hear more about that school. It's known for its focus on cerebrodiverse learners. I love that phrase. Hard to say, but I love the phrase. And I think that when you talk about how your school integrates the science of reading into its curriculum, there can be really lessons for other schools, lessons that they can take from your approach. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So yes, I love to talk about the Southport School, of course. It's what brings me great joy every day to see these kids who are cerebrodiverse. And when we talk about cerebrodiversity, what's important to acknowledge is that our species benefits from the collective heterogeneity of the way that our brains are different. It's one of the distinct advantages of our species. And when we see it through a lens of human development, we see the huge value that's brought to us, to be able to kind of differentiate, to be able to grow as humans. What's amazing at the Southport schools, we see these kids, these cerebrodiverse kids, who oftentimes have really struggled or hit a wall in their previous learning environment, and they come into a place like this and can really thrive. I will go back to one of the comments you made a little earlier about what Julie Washington said about, a science test becomes a reading test. One of the huge opportunities, and this is something that we really have grounded as an important framework here at the Southport School, is every teacher here is trained in effective literacy instruction. Every teacher here is trained in the science of reading, whether they're teaching math or science or music, because every class is not just every class they're reading something, right? So every class is a reading class, but it's also an opportunity to reinforce good reading practices. And so, I'm going to double down on that morphology example for a second. If I'm a social studies teacher and I'm teaching the concept of Pangea, pan means all, geo means earth. I want to leverage that morphology instruction in the social studies class to reinforce and help build that corpus of knowledge and understanding for kids. So, what we do here is we train every teacher in the same way, whether it's in our literacy instruction, our executive function work, the strategies for comprehension, social emotional well-being. We train every single teacher here the same way so that all those evidence-based concepts can extend throughout the entire day for the student.
Right. And that just seems like a really valuable approach because it impacts all aspects of learning for a student. And again, when I was talking about the fact that there are things that other schools can take away from approaches that have been shown to be effective for young learners, this is one of them. And so thank you for sharing that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I think one interesting thing is oftentimes when I speak, one of the questions I'll ask the audience, if it's educators, I'll say, how many of you remember what it was like to learn to read, or how many of you remember learning to read? And typically very, very few hands go up. The hands that go up are almost always from somebody who struggled to learn to read. And so I think sometimes we forget that learning to read is a process that takes time. And we need a lot of time for it. We just don't devote enough time in our day to help build a reading brain. And so that's another reason why having people, having your faculty and staff educated to understand the reading brain and effective components of literacy instruction can just be really, really helpful.
Right. Are there things that educators and parents can do today? That someone is listening to this conversation today. Are there things that they can do today to make a meaningful difference? Because, you shared such great information, and I think parents are going to feel like, I need to do something. Educators might say, I need to do something. Are there things that you recommend?
That's another great question. I think, often, look, we're all busy. Our lives are crazy. And, I think when I think about a teacher's life, and I used to teach in the classroom, I miss it. You've got your kids in front of you, you're writing lesson plans, you're grading assignments. And as parents, I've got 4 kids at home. I know it's a hectic life too. I think, an important thing to do, I think, is ask yourself the question, what is working? What do you think is working effectively? And what do you think is not working effectively? Or where do you see kids struggle? And I think it's really important to acknowledge that is not a reflection of our intention, or we shouldn't kind of be self-deprecating about that. We should see that, back to your earlier comment, as an opportunity for change. And so, I do think, at least opening up and asking that question. And, I think even just going online and thinking about, understanding or learning more about aspects of reading. Like we've got Emily Hanford's podcast that, has been really transformational. Just listening to it and hearing some of those stories. The Dyslexia Foundation is another great resource. We have tons of videos of presentations over the years from really prominent researchers, including people like Julie Washington or Nicole Patton-Terry or Marianne Wolf, talking about the reading brain and important aspects of the reading brain. And those videos are on the website. It's yesread.org, I think. Those things are out there. So I think even just investing that 30 minutes or 20 minutes to, listen to Emily or watch a video, or, I think about a resource like Reading Rockets, where, just taking a quick dive into some aspect of reading, whether you're an educator or a parent, and getting a snapshot of, even if it's just that one practice or that one component, and trying it out and seeing, how does that resonate with you? Is that different from what you're doing? Can you try something like that in your classroom tomorrow or at home?
Absolutely. And those are such great practical things that people can do now, right? They can click on that website, they can get that information in their brain, and they can, again, pay attention to what's working and what is not working. Because we've been saying, it's an opportunity to do something different that can make a difference.
That's right. Exactly right. And again, it doesn't need to be, of course, we want everybody trained and knowledgeable at the highest level, but we all know that takes time, and you have to build that, knowledge and experience incrementally. So it's really, again, taking that first big step, that first healthy risk that really starts to shift that conversation.
Dr. Powers, I cannot thank you enough for being here, for sharing your expertise, all these great insights with us. If listeners want to connect with you to learn more about the Southport School, about your work, what is the best way for them to connect with you?
Sure. They can certainly reach out to me. My email is bpowers@southportschool.org, or they can check out the Southport School website, southportschool.org. We also have a great resource here. It's called the Southport CoLab. We provide a lot of resources, things for parents, things for educators. So southportcolab.org. And then again, I would encourage people to look into the Dyslexia Foundation. There's just a ton of great resources on our website around evidence-based practices that we know are effective for a variety of learners, including English learners, including students who are disenfranchised or at risk for reading failure for a number of reasons, even beyond dyslexia.
Wonderful. And I will be sure to put a link to all of that information in the show notes. Thank you again for being here.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode and others that we have also shared. And if you have, be sure to share it with others so that they can benefit from the information as well. I hope that you will also sign up for our newsletter at childnexus.com. There you will get insights, strategies, event updates, all designed to support kids and teens just like yours. Thank you again for listening, and I will see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.